Hey, welcome everybody to today's Cardiovascular MR Journal Club. Today I'm in Montreal, so thanks for having you and joining in. I already saw a couple of known faces, so that's great. I'm also specifically welcoming Charlotte Manesty, who will present one of the two papers we're currently looking at. And I will share my screen. Today's topic is about pacemakers and MR in patients with implantable devices. And that has been a topic for a while now. So there has been this paper by Russo et al. With Steve Wolf as a senior author published in the New England Journal 2 years ago that kind of was just an example of a row of number of papers before that indicated that MR in patients with pacemakers and even defibrillators may not be as dangerous as previously thought, and it's still by most considered a contraindication. But as already a lot of anecdotal evidence showed that in that paper in the New England Journal, there were 1,000 patients, and they had basically, these were non-cardiac, so just all comers, and they didn't observe anything really concerning. However, there are also some experimental studies that have shown that the leads may heat up and even that, of course, that pacemaker function may be significantly affected. So we all know that pacemakers are switched on and off, and a lot of happens through magnetic fields. So exposing that pacemaker to a strong magnetic field, of course, will have its impact. But since the experience clearly said that this may not be that dangerous, so there was overall concern. Hey, maybe we should try to use that in these patients, but of course not just like that, but in this kind of supervised fashion. So now we're actually in the second generation of all this development. Now we're having papers coming out that are done in patients with pacemakers and implantable devices, and that actually show how this works in certain clinical applications in the cardiovascular environment. So in the two papers we discussed today, the first one, I will quickly go through it, is from the Leipzig team. So Ingo and Cosima Jahnke1 have been in MR since quite a while. Gerd Hendricks is the chief of cardiology there. And Timm is the first author of this paper that is called Cardiovascular MR Imaging in Patients with Cardiac Implantable Electronic Devices, Best Practice and Real-World Experience. So what did they do? They had 200 patients coming in as for cardiac indications, but all comers, consecutive patients between 2014 and 2017, examined them at 1.5 Tesla using a standard procedure, or with all what you could say belongs to a standard MR. That's an ECG, during the MR, pulse oximetry, respiratory motion, at least visual control, non-invasive blood pressure, and then also permanent visual and voice contact. They interrogated the devices before and after. The devices they had were arranged, so these were pacemakers, then they had loop recorders and ICDs. And then they looked what happened to these patients and to these devices. So this is basically the protocol they call the Leipzig protocol. So if there is an indication for a patient with a pacemaker or another device, there's a chest X-ray. If there are abandoned leads, then we do not know enough about that, especially when it was within the last 6 weeks. That probably will also go away over time, but still for now we say, okay, now maybe you should find something else to look for your clinical question. Then there is the interrogation before. In the pacemaker and the ICD, it's basically the same. So the question is, are they dependent, pacemaker dependent? If yes, they put them on an asynchronous mode. If they're not, then you turn the pacing off. It's just that in the ICDs, you also deactivate the anti-tachycardia therapy function, no matter what, if they're dependent or not. So that's the only difference. So you basically prepare the pacemaker for that by either switching it off or putting it into basically a default mode. Then during the CMR, they propose to, of course, supervise the patient carefully, having an individual present. That is important that is competent in terms of understanding the device and its action and the potential risks. So that could be a physician, but it could also be a nurse. Then on top of that, a cardiologist with expertise in device integration and ACLS. So that's maybe something that is not done in all the institutions, but that's what they propose, having a cardiologist on site. And then continuous hemodynamic monitoring, but not in a physiological sense, but looking at basically the vitals, so blood pressure, oxygen saturation, ECG, and symptoms. That's what is already part of a regular MR. And then after the CMR, they do a full device interrogation and reactivate function, reprogram to original settings, and then they have a follow-up after 3 to 6 months. So what they found was with regular MR, and these are just sample images where you see familiar artifacts, and we'll come back to that in the other paper. But for some sequences, this can be significant, but in most sequences, it allows still to look at function, as you can see here, or scars. And so they saw that these in 200 patients, they did that, and they followed 164 of them. The others were lost to follow-up due to irrelevant reasons. Of those, 100 patients had a non-MR conditional device where you would have had to be careful previously, and the others had 24% had an MR conditional advice. Morning or afternoon. Morning. And then there were loop recorders. About 10% were pacemaker dependent, what they then, and even in these patients, they now coming to the results, they didn't observe anything really clinically meaningful in a concerning way. So table 1 gives the endpoints. They were predefined, so they declared certain events as basically their primary endpoints. And the only one that basically happened was that there was an observed ventricular tachycardia. Now, if I read that paper correctly, yes, that sounds concerning, but in fact, it's not, considering that all of these 3 patients, and I'm basically a spoiler alert here, all these 3 patients actually were admitted because of ventricular storm or frequent sustained VTs. So, of course, why should they be protected in the scanner from arrhythmia? So I think it's more by chance that they also had during the scan VT, because otherwise it is not really, it's also from a physiological point of view, not necessarily there's anything else that would be more probable than that. So when we look at the patients basically were fine, despite these, and only these 3 who came already in with frequent VTs, they had their VTs also there. And when we look at the devices, there were actually some changes to the impedance. So it's basically, for those like me, the non-physicists, that's basically the electrical resistance of the system. So there was a certain percentage between 10 and 16% for the pacemaker, and 24 to 28%, depending on whether you look at it early or during follow-up, that had a change of the impedance. So the resistance of the whole thing changed. And then in the ICDs, where you also have a high voltage lead impedance, there was also a change in the follow-up up to 50%. So the devices apparently may show some changes, and especially because that was not observed in a reference group they also included, which they don't talk a lot about in the paper, but in the introduction and in one part of the methods section, they write about that. So, when we look at the clinical events, just to reiterate that these VTs were not considered device or scan related. So bottom line here is there was no significant or no sufficient evidence or convincing evidence that the CMR scan itself would cause any significant arrhythmia. So 6% had impaired image quality. That's not surprising. It's actually a good sign, and no other arrhythmias were found during follow-up. And I already mentioned that it was in the table. There was a change in the lead impedance in 10% of the pacemaker leads and in 25% of the ICDs. Then in the longer-term follow-up, that was basically confirmed and maybe even a little bit more. The function was not significantly otherwise, and this is really the reference population, so there were close to 1,000 pacemakers studied there, and compared to the control group, there was not significant difference in terms of function, also the other threshold changes. So there is a nice discussion, and I will not go into that as usual. So the authors say something about study limitations, but I think I don't see a real strong study limitation. Of course, you could always look for larger reference cohorts, and you could always look at other device brands and makes. So there's always more to do. But to me, it is definitely the conclusion is that CMR is safe in patients with implanted defibrillators, pacemakers, or loop recorders. There is a change of the impedance of the devices, but there is no clinically meaningful consequence of any of that. The patients who have arrhythmia may also have arrhythmia in the scanner, but otherwise this study did not show any significant added risk by the scan itself. Now, regarding the protocol they're using, this is certainly an interesting discussion. So as usual, I welcome everybody. If you have a question or a comment, just type it in the chat window. You have a chat window in Zoom. You can type in your question and I will ask them or discuss that then for you all. You also, you can just unmute yourself and speak up and ask that question. So here the discussion is, while we probably agree all on what is in the protocol, the only thing is the question, do we need a cardiologist on site who can do that? Because this is, of course, a logistical issue. Having a nurse who is with a patient is certainly considered doable, or should be considered doable everywhere. But having a cardiologist sit for, let's say, 4 hours in the MR scanner doing nothing than just watching that nothing happens may be a logistical issue. So this is certainly something I would discuss. I saw that Tariq raised his hand, so just either speak up or type it in the chat if you want to ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there were any patients with epicardial leads in these studies.
Yes, they had one patient or two patients with epicardial leads, so it was not enough to draw some meaningful conclusions on that, but it was involved in that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll just double check here. Yeah.
Yeah, we went through this issue.
Sorry, I was wrong. The epicardial was excluded here. So they excluded these two patients. Okay, here it's fine. So sorry, what was that?
We went through this issue at BI, and they required to have an EP person on the scan.
Okay.
So we need to have an EP person there. So that's why we're not really doing it, because it creates a scheduling issue and resource issue.
Yeah, I can imagine. And if you say EP person, you're talking about an electrophysiologist. So not a nurse. Yeah. So we're here. We are not having a cardiologist or radiologist, for that matter, in the scan room. We have a nurse there, and we have an EP person, basically, quote unquote, on call. So they're in the same building, and they know that there are studies ongoing with patients who have a pacemaker. And so they are basically available for a call, and they would be there in a few minutes. So that's how we solve that. Yeah. Would be interested to hear others, but in the interest of time, I already basically used up my 15 minutes for that paper. I would now ask, but if you have other questions, just feel free to type them in and we can discuss them later. So I welcome Charlotte Manesty, and thank you very much for making this possible. I know you had to shuffle around some tasks. So the paper has been published in the International Journal of Cardiology and is called Clinical Impact of CMR with Optimized Myocardial Scar Detection in Patients with Cardiac Implantable Devices. So here we're at the next stage. So we don't worry that much about the safety anymore, but now it's about the image quality and the diagnostic accuracy. This paper is from institutions in London, St. Bartholomew, the Bart Center, and also with Peter Kellman as a physicist from the NIH. So Charlotte, thank you very much for calling, and if you could unmute yourself.
Great, thank you.
Hi.
Thanks for inviting me to talk today. So I'm presenting from the Barts Heart Centre in London, and as Matthias mentioned, we have physics support from Peter Kellman, who enabled us to have the wideband sequence. So what we were interested in, as we've just heard, is not so much the safety aspect, because we've been scanning non-MRI.
Sorry, Charlotte, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you share your screen? And do you have a PDF you want to share that we can share there?
Yeah, I've got it. So I'm just trying to share my screen.
Okay, so there's in one of the windows, there's a green square at the bottom that says share. I had to stop sharing it, but I did.
Sorry, apologies. I'm just trying to find.
Yeah, there are sometimes two windows in Zoom. That's sometimes confusing. This share, or you can also go to the left upper to the menu, and there is on the meeting, there's a start share.
Sorry.
So then you can walk us through the PDF at your pace.
Oops, sorry.
Don't worry. We have.
Is that working now?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Sorry. So as we've heard, this was more a paper looking at the clinical utility rather than looking at the safety aspect, because obviously there's been lots of data published on safety, and we've been scanning non-MRI conditionals for devices for some time. But there's referral bias in that people are not necessarily referring their patients for MRI scans because they're concerned that the images may not be diagnostic. And we as CMR doctors need to ensure that we are confident that patients that are referrals we're accepting for scans are likely to give images that are going to be of use to the referring physicians. So this was a retrospective study looking at patients who'd had MRI scans performed for clinical purposes. We recruited 133 patients who had 136 CMR studies. Nearly 40% of them had either ICDs or cardiac resynchronization defibrillators in situ, so high energy devices, and 42% of the devices were non-MRI conditional. I'll go into the results in more detail later, but importantly, what we were looking at was the clinical impact of the scans and the impact of artifact on the image quality. So obviously, most people recognize that there needs to be some adaptation of your sequences if you're scanning these devices. If patients have significant artifact, then you may need to move to a gradient echo cine imaging protocol, but the majority of patients that are referred for MRI scanning or cardiac MRI scanning are referred for tissue characterization. And so it's the late GAD sequences that we want to optimize in these patients. And a wideband protocol using a wideband inversion pulse was initially suggested by the UCLA group, and has been reported in several publications, but we were actually looking at the clinical impact of this and the incremental benefit over a standard late GAD sequence in our patients. So all patients were accepted for scans if they had MRI conditional devices. We follow fairly strict protocol for patients with non-conditional devices, whereby our referrers need to justify their referral by confirming that A, the scan results are likely to change device or change patient management. There's no other imaging modality that's able to address the question, and all our patients will sign a written consent form if they have a non-conditional device before they're scanned. We excluded anybody who had a device implanted implanted prior to 2001, so a generator implanted prior to 2001, because we know that those devices are more likely to have power on reset and to have problems. And we excluded any patients who were pacing dependent with an ICD where we were unable to program the anti-tachycardia therapies off whilst maintaining asynchronous pacing. In fact, as it came down to it, that did not actually exclude any patients, but that was our protocol, and those are the patients that we exclude on a clinical basis and continue to do so. We monitored both for safety outcomes and then clinical impact. So safety outcomes, clinical outcomes, and then changes to lead parameters according to the MagnaSafe registry criteria, which have been previously published. All our patients were scanned on the 1.5T scanner, and we use a device-dependent sequence selection strategy here at Barts, whereby patients who have implantable loop recorders or pacemakers, we initially try to scan using a standard imaging protocol, but if we find significant artifact on the initial late GAD images, then we will move to using the wideband sequence in these patients. All patients who have ICDs or cardiac resynchronization defibrillators, we will immediately scan using the wideband sequence. Now, the wideband sequence we use at Barts is one that Peter Kellman developed. It's a motion-corrected phase-sensitive inversion recovery sequence, which proves to be robust in our patients. We can talk later about why we use this sequence, but the main reason is that the majority of our patients that we're scanning with ICDs or CRTs are relatively frail. They're unable to breath hold for long periods, often have arrhythmias. Almost by definition, they've got an ICD in. So we need a fairly robust sequence that's we're not going to need to repeat too many times, and the patients are able to perform whilst free breathing. So following the scan, all images were analysed for artefacts by an observer with more than 4 years experience. We graded artifact both on a segment by segment basis and also on an overall scan quality basis on a scale of 0 to 4, where 0 was no artifact at all, apologies, and 4 essentially meant that the image was entirely uninterpretable. We then assessed inter-observer reproducibility of artifact grading, and then assessed the impact of the scan reports on the patient's diagnosis and management. And here again, we have predefined definitions of what a new diagnosis was and what a change in management was. So a new diagnosis was if the final diagnosis had been principally determined by the cardiac MRI findings and was not suspected from investigations prior to the MR. And a change in management was the criteria that is used in several other research studies, whereby either the findings led directly to guiding or avoiding an invasive procedure, initiating or discontinuing medication, including anticoagulation, hospital admission or discharge, and genetic testing in the case of cardiomyopathy patients. So in terms of our results, as I said, we acquired 136 scans in 133 patients. Our patients were relatively sick, so 18% of them were current hospital inpatients, and I'll go into a bit more detail about who those patients are in a minute. As I said, the majority, or 42% of patients had non-MRI conditional devices, and a third of patients were pacing dependent, of whom 7 had ICDs. Again, the patients, in terms of image quality, 14% of the patients had atrial fibrillation. So we've got a quite high inpatient population and quite a high population of patients who are in atrial fibrillation, both of which obviously are likely to hinder our image quality. In terms of indication, looking at this table, we can see that the majority of patients were referred for a suspected cardiomyopathy, but also a significant number of patients were referred to understand where the substrate for an arrhythmia was, particularly before VT ablation. We're quite a large electrophysiology unit here, and we have a lot of patients referred with ventricular arrhythmias for ablation. So that was one of the major indications in these patients. In terms of the impact of the cardiac MRI scans, it resulted in an unexpected new diagnosis in 16% of patients and changed clinical management in 83% of studies. So the yield was extremely high from these scans. The most frequent new diagnosis was myocardial infarction in patients in whom this had previously not been suspected. And bear in mind, a large proportion of these patients already undergone coronary angiography or echocardiography. There was also quite a high proportion of patients where left ventricular thrombus was discovered, which was previously undiagnosed. And in all of these patients, this was prior to ablation for ventricular tachycardia. This is, of course, of particular relevance, as I'll show in one patient down here, where many of these patients were going and were planned for endocardial ablation. So this was a patient planned for an endocardial ablation procedure later on that day. You can see that they had a big LAD infarct with a large apical thrombus, and potentially proceeding to an endocardial ablation could have led to this patient having a stroke. There were also new diagnosis of cardiac sarcoidosis in patients with no prior diagnosis of extracardiac sarcoid, and that was supported by subsequent PET or CT or biopsy, and then some other slightly rarer or less common diagnoses detected, including cardiomyopathy and myocarditis. In terms of the impact on clinical management, the most common impact was planning for VT ablation in terms of scar localization, or changing medications, including anticoagulation and antiplatelet therapy in patients in whom new myocardial infarctions were diagnosed. In terms of looking at artifact was definitely more common. I'm just going to show one more slide here. Artifact was definitely more common in patients with the larger devices. So this figure, which was published in the supplement, looks at artifact, and this is the frequency of artifact across the whole patient population. And you can see that it's more common in the anterior segments, and it's definitely far more common in those patients with the high energy devices, ICDs and CRTs. This is using conventional late GAD imaging, and then using wideband late GAD imaging, you can see that artifact is reduced significantly, particularly in the patients with larger high energy devices, where although there was some residual artifact in some of the patients, this was removed in nearly all of the patients, so it was significantly improved. In terms of MRI conditionality in artifact, it was clear that there was similar artifact in ICDs, whether they were MRI conditional or not. But there were various different new diagnoses. So some of the images here, this is using the wideband late GAD enhancement imaging seen on the top and the conventional late GAD imaging on the bottom. So we've described this one here. You can see where using conventional late GAD imaging would not have revealed that apical thrombus. This is a patient who'd been referred with a DCM and a Glenn planned ablation strategy. And here you can see that they clearly had a small infarct, and that led to us starting secondary preventative medication. And this was a patient where they were planned to go ahead and have coronary artery bypass grafting for single vessel LAD disease, but actually their LAD territory was essentially non-viable. So they were planned to move to a medical therapy strategy. In terms of looking at late GAD, nearly a third of studies had those with non-diagnostic studies using conventional late GAD enhancement sequences. Wideband actually allowed acquisition of diagnostic images, so nearly all artifact removed, and that resulted in a significant incremental impact on new diagnosis and patient management. So using conventional late GAD imaging, new diagnoses were made in 9% of studies, but by using wideband, new diagnoses were made in an additional 7% of studies. And in terms of changes in management, similarly, it was increased from 46% of studies to 75% of studies using the late GAD strategy. In terms of safety, as we kind of predicted, there were no significant clinical complications during or following MRI, and there were no significant changes in pacing parameters, just some small minor changes in a small minority of patients, none of which had clinical impact and none of which required any changes to pacemaker programming or device positioning. So I think in summary, this was a study which really showed the clinical impact of optimized scar assessment. It showed the clinical yield not only using standard cardiac MRI, but also the incremental value of using optimized scar imaging with a wideband sequence. I think importantly, the yield is in fact likely to be higher than even for a standard cardiac MR scan, largely because patients are going to have to have got over quite significant referrer bias, particularly with those with non-conditional devices, whereby other imaging modalities have failed to give an answer. And so patients have got to overcome higher barriers to get to a cardiac MRI scan, meaning that potentially the yield is even higher, and actually meaning that it's more important that we get diagnostic images in these patients who have non-conditional devices. Here we see in this figure the fact that patients with change in management, the yield was greatest or incrementally greatest in those with the higher energy devices where the conventional late GAD sequences were potentially not diagnostic. So there was just one further point that we wanted to raise in this paper was the fact that although we now have got increasing safety data for MRI scanning in patients with both non-conditional and conditional devices, certainly in the UK, the provision of MRI scanning in this population is inadequate. So in the UK, still only half of centres across the whole of the UK will scan even MRI conditional devices. So trying to get patients with non-MRI conditional devices scans can be problematic. And there's only a certain small proportion of centres in the UK that will scan non-conditional devices. Just in terms of study limitations, it's important to say this is a single centre study. We also didn't look at mapping or stir imaging for edema. From our experience, mapping can be problematic, and unless you use strategies to try and correct for artifact resulting from devices, the mapping results need to be taken with some caution. Stir imaging seems to be a little bit more resistant to artifact than the mapping sequences, but clearly this will be something that we address in the future and try and develop sequences that are specifically tailored to device patients. But in conclusion, diagnostic scar imaging results in significant changes to clinical management in the majority of patients, but we would recommend using some metal artifact reduction strategy, and wideband imaging is certainly one way to go, and there's various different wideband strategies available. As I said, we use the wideband PSIR MoCo sequence simply because we found it to be most clinically robust in our patients, many of whom are quite sick with arrhythmias. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. So I think the message that you also pointed out, I think clearly has to go out. Hey guys, it's important for patients with suspected myocardial disease, be it scar or ischemic origin or non-ischemic infiltration, that these patients undergo a CMR because it changes clinical decision-making. And the concerns about safety, as important as they are, should not prevent us from doing that. There are a few things to consider, and there was actually a question from, or concern from Dana Peters. She says that in the episodes of VT in ICD patients might be a concern, even especially for a non-MD person, and I certainly agree with that. But I think the simple clinical conclusion would be that, hey, if a patient has VT storms or has that frequent VTs, you don't want to unhook this patient from a monitor anyway. So just in these patients, you have to be a little bit more careful. But once it's reasonably safe, I think it's probably on a case-by-case basis. It should be safe enough to have that patient in the scanner. And if I'm on the CCU and I have a patient with really incessant VTs, I will not let this patient go to an echo anyways, for that matter. So it's to me not much different in an MR scanner, especially because I think in an MR scanner sometimes patients are better supervised in terms of their rhythm than elsewhere. It's a little bit of a pity for companies like Medtronic, who have put millions and millions of dollars into MR conditional devices, and now the result is that they're not much different in terms of the safety, however, and not even the artifacts. But maybe it was important to keep MR alive for that matter. And one question I have to you, Charlotte, is you said there are other strategies. Do you want to expand on that? And would you want to continue without having a wideband sequence or another strategy to reduce artifacts? Clearly seeing and not seeing that ventricular thrombus to me seemed like a very, very important piece of information. So would you, after this study, go without? And if so, are there other alternatives to the wideband sequence?
So I think several things to say. Firstly, there are simple things that you can do. So for example, if you acquire all of your sequences, if you've got a non-motion corrected late GAD sequence, if you acquire all of your sequences in inspiration, then you're slightly moving the heart away from the generator, you'll slightly reduce your artifact. You can try changing the phase encoding direction. You can slightly manually do a frequency shift to change, to try and reduce the artifact. But wideband sequences are now becoming more widely available. I know that GE have one on their scanner. Siemens have just released a whip with one on. They are becoming more widely available. In terms of the actual sequences that are available, there are 2D sequences or 3D sequences available, and certainly many groups that use a 3D late GAD sequence. We don't use it simply because often these patients have arrhythmia, meaning that you may have a very long 3D sequence acquisition, and if your TI is wrong, if you use a phase sensitive sequence, it's going to be even longer to acquire, and you don't really want to try and repeat your imaging. And if your TI is wrong, then you may have problems. We found that in these patients, it's more robust just to use a 2D single shot. Well, not single shot, a 2D sequence, and using the MoCo PSAR sequence makes it more robust for the sick patients. I mean, just in terms of VT, we actually scanned, I mean, I'm a cardiologist, I'm actually a device-trained cardiologist, so we scan quite high-risk patients. We scanned one of these patients actually in slow VT. Two of the other patients were on lignocaine infusions during the MR. But I mean, obviously that's not something you're going to do unless you've got the personnel and kind of backup and safety equipment available. But we've scanned quite high-risk patients without having any problems.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to thank everybody. Before leaving, I want to point to the Journal Club in 2 weeks, on June 25. We'll have Rohan Dharmakuma present. So we go from a more clinical topic today to a more experimental. So this is a paper published in Science Translational Medicine, and it's about oxygenation-sensitive MR imaging in a dog study for myocardial ischemia, and basically a very novel way of identifying myocardial ischemia using this approach of oxygenation-sensitive imaging. And they will also then add their other paper on unsupervised myocardial segmentation for cardiac bulk, basically an automated evaluation of the oxygenation-sensitive images. So next Journal Club, a little bit more experimental, and then after that we will go again with more clinical. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and especially for Charlotte for this beautiful presentation and discussion. Wish you all a great day or a great evening wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye-bye.